So welcome back, everybody, and I hope everyone enjoyed the virtual networking break. No coffee or refreshments provided by us, anyway, I'm afraid. But hopefully, you maybe managed to grab something yourself, and more importantly, hopefully you got the chance to explore the platform and to meet and to chat with some of your fellow participants during the or in the networking area. And also to explore some of the exhibition booths. So I hope everyone enjoyed that and found that part of the event useful. And just to say that towards the end of the day today, towards the end of the session today, we will be having another short networking break in the same way. So there'll be an opportunity again to similarly explore those areas of the site towards the end of the day. So now I'm delighted to have the opportunity to now introduce the second part of our schedule today. So next up, we have a panel discussion focusing on keeping the world connected in times of crisis. So as I'm sure everyone is aware, that there's been an unprecedented level of additional pressure being put on networks around the world. And we're delighted to have some key speakers from both the policy and industry side who are going to be talking about some of the measures that are being taken in countries all around the world to deal with this huge pressure that is being put on networks and to maintain connectivity services. So I'm delighted now to first of all bring up and introduce Joanne Lemay from LYA. So Joanne is going to be moderating the session today, and she's also going to be providing a short introduction to the key issues before she introduces our panelists. So Joanne, welcome, and I'd like to now pass over to yourself for your introduction to the session, and then for you to introduce the panelists. So over to you. And just actually one thing to mention before I do, sorry, Joanne, is just again to remind you to please post your questions and comments in the chat bar on the right-hand side of the screen. So there will be plenty of time for discussion in the second half of this session. So please do post your comments, post your questions, and Joanne will be putting a few of those to our speakers at the second half of the session. So without further ado, Joanne, I'll pass over to yourself, and looking forward to hearing your introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. I hope everyone hears me really well. So, and thank you for doing this online session. I think it's very creative, and I hope everyone enjoys it and finds it very useful. So my name is Joanne Lemay. I'm a co-president of Lemay Associates. I'm actually based in Montreal. So I say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. LYA is a management consultancy. We are very active in spectrum matters, in telecom matters, in broadband deployment in rural areas, all kinds of things. And you can go and check our website later if you're interested. But first, before we get started, I would like to go through a short presentation. So here you have I guess it's for people who are like me, maybe having breakfast or at this time, if we want to get started on keeping the world connected in times of crisis. We have an hour. We have a fairly busy agenda. So if we could go to the next slides, I'm speaking now for a few minutes. And you have here the same agenda as Dan mentioned. Commissioner Brendan Carr will start, followed by Jeremy Godfrey from Comreg and BEREC, the European regulators, Artie Holla from the satellite industry, Mr. Persson from Ericsson, and Johan Kittelaar from Facebook. So, and after that, we'll have a good 30 minutes to have a discussion and a reception after that. So it's a very busy 2 hours ahead of us. In terms of the panel discussion, I've put here some key topics. We can discuss them, or you can add to that during the question time. You feel free to add to any of this, but we will touch base on the impact of COVID-19 on telecom networks. As Dan mentioned, these have been substantial. We will discuss, obviously, with our regulator speakers, the actions taken by regulatory, government, and industry, and there have been quite a few. We have also some consumer protection issues. We might talk then as to no disconnection, COVID tracing apps, all kinds of things, and also some of the challenges to maintain connectivity with a focus on remote areas and conspiracy theories, I have to say, since there have been some issues related to that. So, and I'd like to talk about what comes next, what comes after this crisis does get muted, or we hope. So before I go, just a few data points, if you're interested. that we've collected over the last few days. Certainly in March, when the COVID-19 crisis exploded unexpectedly, as we know, well, kind of unexpectedly, but we've seen certainly a surge in daytime broadband usage, as well as voice calls. Voice calls certainly came back, roaring back, should I say. I know personally, I have experienced suddenly that when I was trying to do calls on my mobile, it wasn't going through for the first few weeks, and then it got fixed. So as we know, telecom carriers were quick to, I think, increase traffic, increase capacity where it was needed. So I've put down here just a few examples of increases in broadband usage, which, you know, there have been many, but we can see there's a fairly wide variation. In the UK, Virgin said they saw a 95 traffic increase during daytime. BT was 30 to 60%. Comscore reported that they saw an 18% surge in in-home data usage in the US. Spain, a huge increase in IP network traffic, 40% and 50% increase in voice calls. So this increase in voice communication is quite interesting. Not surprisingly, Netflix also reported a huge increase in subscribers based on what was expected for the same period pre-COVID. So they were expecting to add 7 or so million subscribers, and they ended up adding close to 16 million, although they say they're not sure if they're going to keep those for the long term. And that has actually, I just mentioned the third point on the chart, we've seen some FCC action because of the costs involved in terminating and originating traffic. Now, there was certainly a huge imbalance from what was expected. So the FCC actually put together or provided an exemption for additional payments to be made with respect to this imbalance. So if we can go to the next chart. I've put here a list of, since we are discussing spectrum, I've put a list of some spectrum-related interventions. What we have seen over the last month or so is, for example, the FCC in the US and Comreg in Ireland putting some temporary access or providing some temporary access to additional spectrum to some carriers. And there's been a lot of action on that front in the US, and I have here a list of everything that's been done. T-Mobile on March 16, Verizon, just about everybody has had some access to additional spectrum, which is says temporary access, but I will see how temporary they will be. I think that's going to be interesting to discuss. We have all the carriers, we have wireless ISPs, tribal areas, also New York City Fire Department. So that's quite interesting that it's not just the carriers, but also some large users as well. Same thing in Ireland, where Air3, Vodafone, and Virgin Media, along with the and Irish Aviation Authority, have been given access to additional spectrum. On the other side, we've also seen some delays in some spectrum auctions in France, Spain, Austria, and Portugal. The FCC delayed their 3.5 gigahertz CBRS auction, but just by 1 month. So it went from the start of June, end of June to end of July. So that's just a 1 month delay. Sweden, which, as we know, did not implement a lockdown like many other countries, just announced a new spectrum auction for November. And in Canada, the 3.5 gigahertz auction, which had been announced early March to start in December, is still, of course, planned for end of December start. So there's been no issues on that. On this page here, I've put down a list of spectrum-related interventions in other countries, because obviously there's a lot of countries that are looking at making spectrum available. A lot of it is also, if it wasn't technology neutral, some regulators are saying, well, now you can deploy whatever you want on this band. And I think that's definitely a positive for many carriers. Next slide. There's also a number of actions that have been undertaken to ensure connectivity. And that's, I just list here the FCC actions, but many other regulators, not always formally, sometimes just in discussions with carriers, have taken measures to ensure connectivity. So to ensure that, you know, consumers don't lose their broadband if they can't pay for a few months, that they don't get disconnected. that they're not removed from programs that provide access to low-cost services, and the same thing also providing funding to activities related to distance learning or telehealth. I think those things are we're seeing a huge increase in the level of interest of those type of applications, and it's just for fun. As we know, they are really critical in nature. Next slide. Carriers, as we know, have been also very active. And again, I just list here a few things that were, among all the other things that were undertaken by a variety of mobile and other telecom carriers. So certainly, where it wasn't already the norm, the switch to unlimited packages and providing free broadband access has been a key element. As a few examples here, BT removed all caps on whole broadband plans. AT&T and Verizon have waived data caps and not enforcing late payments. Charter, a U.S. cable co, is offering free broadband and Wi-Fi to student households for 60 days. So those are, others are, we've seen distribution of devices in nursing homes and other types of housing so that the residents could actually, do some Skype or FaceTime with their families who cannot for a fair amount of time go and visit or be in communication. So I think that's just a few examples of activities that have been undertaken. So if I go to the last chart, for our discussion, a few suggestions of what comes next: acceleration of the digital economy, telehealth and telemedicine, distance learning, COVID tracking apps. We don't have a shortage of subject matters to touch upon. So maybe before I can pass the baton, if you want, to the first speaker, which is Commissioner Brandon Carr of the FCC, and we can get going.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you all. And thank you to Forum Europe for hosting this. Forum Europe, for those of you that don't know, really has a stellar reputation for bringing together policy leaders and thinkers from across Europe and really across the world. So putting myself to the side, you are in for another one of those really good panels. In fact, panelists right now are everywhere from Montreal, as we heard. I'm here in Washington, D.C. We have some in Brussels, Stockholm, all over Dublin as well. So it's a really good representation of diverse geographic locations. Happy to talk a little bit real quick about the steps we've been taking at the FCC in light of what really was an unprecedented surge in traffic with COVID-19. So many people here in America and across the world working now from home, kids being out of school, learning from home, and also increased usage of telehealth. So the networks were really put under a surprise stress test. And the good news here in the US is America's telecom infrastructure performed very well. We saw a surge in traffic on the wireline side of somewhere in the range of 25% on average. The mobile wireless networks saw a little bit less increase, which makes sense since people are staying put, staying home, less than 10% here in the US. And the traffic surges were interesting. So typically your highest traffic levels on a network are around 9 p.m. local time. That's when everyone maybe finally has their kids put down and turns on Netflix or streaming services and uses a lot of bandwidth at that point in time. We didn't see a significant surge in traffic above those ordinary peak traffic levels at 9 p.m. local time. What we saw instead was those same type of peak traffic levels spread out longer, including in particular during the day as people are using Zoom and other video conference services and taking up bandwidth. So there was room in the network to absorb this increase in traffic because it didn't significantly exceed normal peak hour traffic levels. At the FCC, though, we really sprung into action, and the FCC's career staff deserves tremendous credit. There was a series of quick and unprecedented action to both make sure the networks hold up, but more directly to make sure that Americans can stay connected. And we launched a Keep Americans Connected pledge, and it had 4, 5, 6 different elements to it. One was boosting access for low-income families, including those that have students that are now working remotely. The private sector, for instance, Verizon and other companies really stepped up and immediately launched completely new programs designed to get low-income Americans online. They've worked as well directly with local school districts. So the LA Unified School District and Verizon launched a program to put 100,000 kids that previously weren't on the internet so they can do distance learning. There's a broader program underway in California and in school districts across the country. We've boosted spectrum assets. So we had some spectrum, for instance, that was just sitting in inventory effectively at the FCC in the pipeline for us to get out, but we accelerated that and provided carriers with immediate access to that spectrum. We also facilitated access to spectrum in the secondary market. So we had carriers for one reason or another that weren't deploying or using spectrum in one area, and we had a carrier that needed to or could put that spectrum to immediate use, and we granted them the ability to do that. We have also taken quick action on the telehealth front. So here in America, as everywhere around the world, right now you don't want people going to brick and mortar healthcare facilities if they don't need the level of care provided there. And so many conditions can now be addressed remotely through telehealth, whether it's a video visit or even conditions like diabetes, where you can monitor your A1C level from home, can all be done without having to leave your home location right now. So within a matter of days, the FCC stood up a new connected care and emergency COVID-19 telehealth program. And this fast-tracked about $300 million in funding to support remote telehealth services, so patients don't need to go to brick and mortar facilities. And that's been a really good success. The prior slides showed some more of the steps we've been taking at the FCC. And just real quick before I end, I want to touch on two more issues, which is spectrum and network security. On the spectrum front, just a week or so ago, we voted on the 6 gigahertz band. And this was about 1,200 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed uses. That's about 5 times the amount of unlicensed spectrum that had been available in the US. And that's going to lead to a significant boost in speeds. And pretty quickly, these devices are going to be on the commercial market now by Christmas. And so we took really bold action there to unleash a new wave of Wi-Fi-like services. And there'll be a lot of innovations beyond just Wi-Fi, but we are really excited about that because that can address what potentially was going to be a bottleneck as we shift to 5G, which is we have all these connected devices now. We're buying all these 5G services. And when you get inside your home, you want it to work just as well as when you have a strong 5G connection outside. And so this 1,200 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum in 6 is really the way to do that. And also finally, C-band was a interesting proceeding here in the US where we were able to repurpose spectrum from satellite providers and open it up for terrestrial 5G use cases. I'm really excited about where we're going to go with those 200 to 300 megahertz of spectrum in the US. That's going to be another big boost to network capacity. And finally, network security. I think the last few weeks has really underscored the importance of taking a hard look at telecom providers and equipment manufacturers that are ultimately beholden to the communist regime in China. At the FCC, we've taken pretty concrete steps. We have prohibited subsidized Huawei and ZTE equipment from going into our network. We've prohibited China Mobile, which is one of the largest wireless providers in the world, from entering the US network based on network security concerns. And right now, we're taking a hard look at a number of other entities that are currently in the US market that may be beholden to the communist regime. I think as we've seen with COVID-19, that regime has been disappearing people, has been hiding the truth, spreading disinformation to pursue and push its own geopolitical agenda. So I think what we're seeing right now reinforces the concerns we've had in the US for a long time about network security from entities that may ultimately be beholden to that regime.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you. That was a very interesting talk, and certainly the FCC has been really very extremely active. So we're really glad to hear about that. And so maybe now we can move to the second speaker, Jeremy from Comreg and Barrick.
Hi, thanks very much, Joanne, and thanks to Forum Europe for organizing this innovative conference. I look forward to the panel discussion. I think the European experience has been quite similar to the American experience that Brendan was talking about. So as lockdowns became imminent, I think we saw a lot of customers purchasing more broadband or upgrading their broadband speeds in anticipation of needing to work from home. The traffic has grown massively. Based on what Brendan said, I think probably even more in Europe than had been experienced in the US. But again, as in the US, the impact on the peak has been less dramatic than the overall impact. So I think, Joanne, you had numbers of 60%, 90% average daily traffic. The peak impact there has been a peak impact, but not as great. I think we weren't quite sure what was going to happen, but in fact, the networks have coped extremely well with that traffic. It's not just a question of the spreading out of the traffic across the day. I think we also found that the networks are built with a large amount of spare capacity and headroom, because the average evening peak can sometimes be exceeded. I think in the week or two before lockdowns came to Europe, Microsoft had released an upgrade of Call of Duty, which put actually a bigger strain on the networks than the COVID, the pandemic-related traffic has. So one thing I would like to say, which is that right at the beginning, the European Commission asked Netflix and YouTube and some other streamers if they wouldn't mind reducing streaming quality so as to conserve some of that headroom. So I think that has been picked up on in the United States. I've seen commentators say that this is a sign that Europe's networks haven't coped well, and a sign of the superiority of say, the American approach to net neutrality regulation or other regulatory approaches. I think we can have a good debate about the pros and cons of different regulatory approaches, but I don't think there has in fact been any significant difference in the experience of the networks in Europe and America, and it wouldn't be correct to say that there had been a difference and that was somehow gave some insight. Apart from the traffic and the networks, I mean, the networks have obviously, they've added a bit of interconnect capacity and so forth. Similarly, as Joanne, as you said, Ireland has also made some spectrum available in the 700 megahertz band, and we've done some liberalization in the 2.1 gigahertz band in order to give greater flexibility to the mobile operators to meet the demand. That, I think, has been unique in Europe. I think some other places, as you said, have also postponed some of their auctions. I think it's worth talking about some of the other impacts on the operations of the telecom sector. So obviously operating at a time when people are being asked to stay at home, that applies as much to telecom industry employees. Stay at home if you can, but come to work if you can't. So I think generally telecoms has been regarded as an essential service, but I think we've seen people on the customer care side have some difficulties, particularly if they had care staff working, say, in India, where the care staff weren't able to come to work. And also there have been issues with staff going into customer premises to do installations. Some of the telecoms companies have decided not to do that. Some customers don't want that to happen as well. Then again, across Europe, we've seen operators do things to keep Europeans connected. So I think the users have been anxious about being able to pay their bills if they hit financial difficulties, and they've been anxious about getting large bills in the event that they use because of the additional usage. So we've seen a variety of things. Some operators have removed usage caps. Some who have unlimited usage packages have removed any fair use policies. Other operators have said to customers, if you want to change to an unlimited package for the duration of the pandemic, then talk to us and we'll give you an affordable, good value unlimited package. So those things have happened. In terms of regulators, there's been some slowing down of regulatory procedures. I think we've all recognized that the telephone companies, the most important thing they can do is keep their customers connected, responding to regulatory requests for information and consultations is a lower priority. It's not to say that regulation has stopped happening, but again, I think we've all been prioritizing what we do there. I think the last couple of things I'll say, I think there are some lessons about the 5G misinformation that has been that, of course, I've been in conferences over the last 2 years where we've all been bemoaning the misinformation about the link, an alleged link between 5G and cancer. That has created fertile ground for people blaming the COVID on 5G, and across a number of different markets in Europe, that has even led to vandalism, arson attacks on masts. Of course, most of the masts being attacked are not in fact 5G masts, some of them providing coverage into hospitals and so forth. But that has been a bit of a worry. And I think working out how best to respond to that it has been something that has been on the minds both of governments, ministries and regulators. I think finally, the last point I would make is I think that the people with access to adequate broadband, to even 30 megs or above, have done very well. Across all the cities in Europe, that is more or less 100% of people in cities have that access. It is, I want to say, certainly have the coverage. It is the users in rural areas who don't have access to fast broadband, who are really suffering as a result of being asked to stay at home. So I think that one of the things we probably will find after the crisis is over is a greater emphasis on universal adequate broadband, and maybe, as you can't have everything as a priority, measuring ourselves by what percentage of people have the next best thing. How widespread is 5G? How widespread is fiber? Will be important issues. But I think those in recent years have taken to the fore at the expense of how many people have got 4G, how many people have got access to at least 30 meg broadband, and those digital divide issues will, I think, become more important for the future. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was quite interesting. I liked your comments about the impact of a Microsoft release, which were just as high as COVID. And also, I think we can come back to your last comment on the users in rural areas, which I think brings me to our next speaker, which is who is Arti Hola of the satellite industry. And you certainly, Arti, you will talk to us about providing services in remote areas with COVID-19. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm delighted to be here for the satellite sector. Our members have certainly been playing a critical role during the crisis, and I'd like to tell you about that and share some thoughts around what we believe that the lessons learned so far are. The first one is about the importance of connectivity. I mean, I think there's no doubt from anybody here that connectivity is absolutely key right now. Without it, we wouldn't have this event. We wouldn't be able to work and do all these 10-hour Zoom meetings that we're all busy doing every day. Remote learning and e-health services wouldn't be provided, and the list goes on. But apart from being glued to televisions to know what's happening in the world, let me share some examples with you of what our members are seeing right now. So the first slide. So Viasat, Hughes and Avanti are some of our members who are providing satellite broadband, and they have seen, can I have the first? Yeah. They've seen up to 70% increase in data traffic on their broadband connections and a hike in subscriptions. Viasat and Hughes have obviously signed the FCC's connectivity pledge that Commissioner Carr was talking about as well. At the same time, we see that MNOs have requested more capacity for backhaul services as more users are working from home, which is often outside urban areas. SES is one of our members who has provided more capacity to an MNO in Alaska. Intelsat has provided more capacity in Japan. And over there, they've seen a 50% increase in traffic across 4,000 3G and 4G sites, which are being backhauled by satellite. At the same time, we see examples from our members who are working with their ministries to provide remote education. So Turksat and Arabsat are just two of our members who have been working with their ministries to do that. And of course, while cruise and yachting is down, maritime connectivity is in fact up, because the crews of cargo ships can't disembark while transporting essential goods from port to port. They need health services, they need entertainment, they need to be able to call their families, and so on. But despite these examples, we shouldn't forget that 49% of the world is still unconnected. So for us, if there's one thing that the crisis has shown, it really is the need for connectivity for all, and that this should be an urgent goal in itself for all the benefits that it brings. The second lesson that we think we've learned is about preparedness. So if we can go to the slide. So when there's a crisis, whether it's a natural disaster or a virus, countries need satellite. They need it for resiliency, they need it for security, for mobility, for the immediacy of deployment, and for all of the services that connectivity enables. And what we've seen specifically in this context is a surge in capacity used by humanitarian actors. One UN mission, which is operating 7 sites across 2 African countries, increased its capacity by 150 megabit per second. And NGOs like Télécoms Sans Frontières are using satellite phones to coordinate Mozambique's response to the virus. At the same time, the Crisis Connectivity Charter that the satellite industry signed with the United Nations Emergency Telecoms Cluster was activated to support relief efforts in Vanuatu because Cyclone Harold struck. So natural disasters, obviously, they don't stop happening just because there's a pandemic. But what I think is interesting is that even in central London, which is the image you can see on the right-hand side of the slides, this is a picture from outside the NHS Nightingale Hospital, and it shows a command vehicle which is relying 24/7 on satellite because they need to be absolutely sure about the reliability and the security of their service, and they can't risk not having communications due to network congestion. So the congestion point brings us nicely to our last lesson learned, which concerns spectrum. The experience that we are all making together really highlights the fact that we need every technology to play its role to get the connectivity job done. And if we accept that every technology has a role to play, which I think is undoubted, then we have to also accept that each one needs certain access to spectrum. We saw that mobile operators had to manage the risk of network congestion carefully, and they worked with regulators to do that. And different measures have been taken to ensure that everybody can have good connectivity. But what's clear is that it's not about identifying more spectrum for IMT, but it is about licensing and using what has been identified for IMT. There was a study done by LS Telcom last year, which showed that across all world regions, or across all ITU regions, what has been harmonized and identified for IMT is not yet licensed, and that needs to be accelerated. But I think this experience also shows us that all services really need to be considered when making spectrum decisions, because each one is somehow relevant or maybe even critical in every country somehow. Thank you.
Thank you, Artie. I think it was interesting to see that you're experiencing new demands in spectrum increase in areas such as, Vanuatu and London as well. So it's really all over the globe. So if we can move on to our next speaker, Ulf Persson from Ericsson, who I think has some also additional data to share with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Lehan, for that introduction. Let me first express my thanks to Forum Europe for this very timely focus on the critical issue of connectivity during these dramatic times. So Ericsson, we have a global presence in more than 180 countries, and we are working to ensure the networks we provide, as well as the networks we manage in more than 100 countries with more than 1 billion users, are all running, and they are running 24/7. Today, 85,000 Ericsson staff are actually working from home, representing 85% of our global workforce. And just to give one example, our staff in our NOC network operating center in Romania, they're all working from their homes. And in spite of that, they continue to remotely manage operators' networks around the world. And our service engineers in the field are as well in most cases. There are some attacks, etc. Jeffrey referred to, but they're able to secure the continued of services. So several important questions are raised for today's panel. In my introduction, I would like to focus on one of them, namely how we've been able to maintain critical communications infrastructure, meeting an unprecedented surge in demand. But I will very briefly at the end also refer to what technologies will connect those not yet connected, not to be forgotten today. On the question of securing connectivity during challenging times, Ericsson regularly performs traffic measurements in over 100 live networks covering all major regions of the world. And these measurements form a representative base for calculating worldwide total mobile traffic. And can I have the next slide, please? And the measurements we have made and showed on this first slide are from affected countries that have seen country lockdown on a larger scale in both Europe and North America. And in the last few weeks, we've seen major shifts in traffic moving from downtown to suburban and residential areas, as more lockdowns mean less mobility and movement into the cities. Mobile broadband networks have experienced this traffic pattern shift with a decrease of data traffic in urban areas and an increase in suburban and residential areas. But as people are moving less and working from home more, as many of you have given witness around, the largest share of traffic increase is being absorbed by the fixed residential network, where the increase has ranged from 20 up to even 100% in different networks around the world. Streaming services are seeing major increases in use to the point where services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and YouTube have decreased the quality of their streaming services to avoid capacity constraints. We heard about that as well. There have also been significant data increase in bi-directional services, such as software and apps for video calls and tools for smart working. Video conferencing service Zoom saw more than 500% rise in daily traffic in the past month as more people use video conferencing to carry out daily work. And stressing these particular services are predominantly on uplink capabilities. I think we heard that from Mario of ITU as well. Namely the process of uploading content. In Italy, for example, where the lockdown has been one of the most stringent, data relating to upload traffic has grown by 40% in some networks. But we can see that service providers have reacted quickly in the last few weeks to adapt to this new normal, taking temporary measures to help customers and to help society stay connected in these challenging times. And this includes either increasing the bucket size or allowing unlimited data for a short period of time. And as a result, some mobile networks are experiencing an increase in data traffic. And in countries severely affected by coronavirus in the last few weeks, we see examples from both Spain and Italy with increases in mobile data packages of between 30 and up to 60 gigabyte without an increase in price. So in general, the impact so far for service providers is that network performance is not affected by these major shifts in traffic. In fact, we're seeing a slight improvement in some performance indicators due to the reduction in handovers as people are less mobile and due to offloading to fixed via Wi-Fi. So to sum up, networks are coping in spite of big challenges in voice and particular data traffic, as well as operational hurdles. So I'll be happy to come back later in the panel regarding the actions we need to see from governments and regulators, especially regarding spectrum for mobile, in order to ensure we can continue to meet society's increasing demand for connectivity, not least for 5G. So now the next slide is up. I know we also expect to cover the issue of connecting those not yet connected. I don't have that much time left, but just like to show this slide from the Ericsson Mobility Report, also updated with the most recent numbers. And my key point is that the major challenge is not the technology issue as such. Already 95% of the world's population are living in areas with mobile coverage. And by 2025, 90% will actually have 4G LTE coverage. So the major challenges, as we see it, are instead around accessibility, affordability, and availability of relevant services. For example, mobile cash, much in demand in markets such as sub-Saharan Africa, and of course, especially these days. But I will be happy to come back to this and other issues in the panel. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ulf. That was really interesting, and maybe we can talk later if is cash dead, since you finished your talk on mobile cash. So I find that's quite interesting. So our last but not least speaker is Johan Kidlar from Facebook, and they certainly face a range of issues with respect to COVID-19. So Johan, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Joanne, for having me on this distinguished panel. And thank you, Forum Europe, for organizing this event. It's great to see that everything's still working and to see that conferences like these can continue to take place in these challenging times. And I'm happy to participate here. So I joined Facebook as a policy director for connectivity a little bit more than 2 years ago. Before, I was a telco and competition regulator in the Netherlands for many years, and I was a member of BEREC. Working closely together with colleagues there like Jeremy Godfrey, who's also on this panel, and I'm happy to see him here again. I won't repeat some of the things that the previous speaker have been saying because of at the time, and I will focus on Facebook mainly, what we have seen and experienced in this area over the last couple of weeks and what we are doing. I think in short, we can conclude also by what has been said already, that Inter is no longer just a convenience, but a necessity. With all the people working from home, connecting with your loved ones, e-health, all these services, we really need it. It was already important, but I think the crisis currently is showing that it's becoming more important even now, and will remain important over time, because I think that some things will change permanently. Facebook's mission is closely linked to all the things we are talking about today. We want to give people the power to build community and to bring the world closer together. And a big part of that mission is related to connectivity. And Artie just said it already. It's sad to see that still about half of the population globally is still unconnected to the internet. And we are doing a lot of things in the areas globally to connect people, and we do so with more than 100 partners, so we don't do it alone, but we work together with partners, typically telcos, but also many other partners who are trying to achieve those connectivity goals. We focus on the issues that were just mentioned also by Ericsson, affordability and accessibility, and we are, as Facebook, technology agnostic, which means that we work together with many partners on all kind of technologies, as long as we can connect people. This can be rural access, it can be open cellular or Wi-Fi, which we will come back to later. If I focus on the challenges, you said this already, Joanne, with COVID-19, and we can move to the next slide maybe, then I think you can sum it up into 3 areas. The first one is about misinformation and harmful content. The second one is about what we have done to support the health community. And the third one is about connectivity itself. If you look at misinformation and harmful content, and I'm aware of the remarks that Jeremy made on the previous intervention, we have done a lot in those areas to, first of all, make sure that people have access to credible information. We do so in close cooperation with the global and local health organizations and with many governments. The second part of what we do in this space is to stop the spread of misinformation and harmful content. We remove content that could cause physical or mental harm, and we stop the spread of misinformation. And I'm more than happy to go a little bit deeper into our efforts in this space later on the panel discussion. The second part where we are working closely together with organizations is in the health community market, and make sure that we can help organizations like the Global World Health Organization and the local authorities by empowering them and giving them the tools to get the right information to people around the globe. We do it in a variety of areas, but we, for instance, give them the tools of our services, and we also try to give them data where they can use those to help spreading or avoiding further spreading of the disease. The third discussion point for today is about connectivity, and we can echo what some of the speakers have been saying here already. We focus first on our own services, and the most important thing is that we keep our services safe and reliable. We, like many others, and like Ericsson just explained, have seen huge traffic increases of our own services. For instance, the total number of messages that we have seen over our network has increased by 50% in those areas which were mostly affected. And we also have been noticing a huge increase in the number of video and voice calls. by using our services, which have been more than doubled. This, of course, means something for our own services because we need to keep them reliable, but it also means something for the underlying networks. And I'm happy to say, and I think the industry as a whole can be proud of what we have achieved so far. I'm happy to say, and also happy to see, that the tech industry and the telcos and the governments have been closely working together in this area over the last couple of weeks, and that we all together have been preventing things from not working properly. We, together with some other tech companies, have lowered the bitrate of our video services to release the pressure on the networks. And we are now engaging closely together in many jurisdictions and working closely together with governments on weekly, bi-weekly calls to make sure that we keep a close eye on the developments there. The last point I wanted to make here is that we engage closely together with policymakers. We, for instance, support the things that Jeremy just mentioned by BEREC and the net neutrality regulation, and how it should be seen in light of the congestion issues. And we believe that the net neutrality regulation in Europe is well suited to deal with congestion. It's got a specific article which can be used in case of traffic congestion. And I think that the last couple of weeks have shown that there shouldn't be any changes to that or actual enforcement of the issues, and that BEREC is also quick with their weekly updates and working closely together with the industry about informing the people about what's going on. We also support governments that are implementing connectivity enhancing policies, whether it's spectrum policy or other kinds of policies. We are fully supportive of those kind of things. For instance, in Peru, we are working together with the telco in close cooperation also with the government on connecting rural areas by delivering broadband via new technology. We have seen that in the UK, there's now a new policy for shared rural network services, which we are supportive of. And as Commissioner Brendan Carr just mentioned already about 6 GHz and Wi-Fi, we are fully supportive of releasing more spectrum for Wi-Fi usage as well. I think it goes without saying, as most of us also today here are connecting via Wi-Fi, that Wi-Fi is really crucial. And let me spend my last minute in my intro to talk about Wi-Fi. Maybe we can go to the next slide, which is inspired on the current decision by the FCC. So for all the details, I'm sure that Commissioner Carr will step in. But I think it's a great example of what you can see, what we can achieve with Wi-Fi. I think we need to avoid that Wi-Fi becomes a new bottleneck, whereas we can deal with all the congestion so well. It should be a pity if Wi-Fi is in the end the one service that will be the most like a bottleneck. And I'm saying so in anticipation of what we can expect in the years to come, because with 5G, it's even more important to have like great Wi-Fi connections because of the 5G offload, but also with the new technologies that you see from the industry, not only by Facebook, many other companies are working in this space with augmented reality and virtual reality, you can imagine. And I'm not hoping that we will face a crisis like this sooner or later, but you can imagine that in years from now, we will be able to have these kind of conferences with even more advanced technologies based on virtual reality technologies. And I think it will be great to be able to use those. And it's a whole industry that's behind it that will be benefiting from more spectrum, unlicensed spectrum in the 6 GHz band. So not only in the US, so we are supportive of all the policies that will release spectrum in 6 GHz globally. More than happy to get back on this or other issues or questions later on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. I think that concludes the presentations from all the speakers. And now I will open up. We've had some questions, and I'll start by asking questions to our panelists. First of all, just so that I don't offend everyone, please know that For those of you asking questions, I do not see all the questions, so there's a triage performed before I see the questions, and since I will try to address all the points that were brought up by the questions that have been put on the private chat system. So if I start with the questions, there were some questions related to the difference in the impact on traffic between fixed and mobile networks. Some people say that we assume that all the traffic is on fixed and on Wi-Fi, I suppose, when you're at home, but that some people mentioned they were streaming this conference on mobile. So can we get some comments on that? And I think in the charts I saw some increases on fixed traffic, but also maybe less increase on mobile. Is that the case, or can we get some comments on that? Yes.
Yeah. Can I start?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, as my chart shows, yes, more dramatic increases in fixed networks since people are based in their homes, working from home, but also increase in mobile. And actually, I have other examples from Sweden's leading operator where they see 30% increase in the fixed traffic, but they also see 15-20% in mobile. So I think it's both and. I think in spite of the fact that people are moving around less, I think also there is increased pressure on mobile. And well, as I said, I mean, it's important to recognize that the networks have been coping, actually, which is really a good sign.
Yes, sir, Jeremy.
Yeah, I just add to that I think with the mobile traffic, another thing we've seen is that it's coming from different places. So mobile traffic is down in city centres and business districts. It's up in suburban areas. So I think the mobile operators have actually have done a fantastic job in re-optimizing their networks, deploying more spectrum on suburban base stations, changing the balance between voice and data, changing the balance between uplink and downlink. There's been one of the operators here told me they've done about 4 months of network optimization in 4 weeks. So I think that's been very good, and I think it's also why I think both for us in Ireland and the FCC, we moved very quickly to also provide the extra spectrum, because we recognise that although we would expect even more increases on fixed networks, there's no reason why people. And Artie talked about resilience. It's I've certainly been in circumstances where I think there was a bit of an outage on fixed networks across Europe last night from one of the major operators, and lots of people fell back to mobile. So it's important to have more than one way of communicating.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I think that's quite interesting. I wanted to bring up the question of the temporary spectrum assignments because, as you mentioned, there's an increase in usage on the mobile as well. But those temporary spectrum assignments, do we see any chance of them becoming permanent? Can I ask Mr. Carr or Commissioner Carr to comment on this, or that they could become more than 60 days, for example? Brendan, if you'd like to start on this.
Yeah, I'm really happy with the quick action the FCC staff took to put more spectrum out there. And I'd love to see it stay out there in the commercial marketplace. Of course, there's one issue with that is we need to make sure that everybody has a fair shot at potentially getting access to that spectrum. So whereas people came to us and requested special authority to use particular spectrum bands in particular areas, we move quickly on it. We want to make sure that everyone has a shot at potentially obtaining and putting that to use. We want to have a mechanism to do that. But generally, I think this highlights why we need to get more spectrum out there and why letting carriers sit on spectrum or quote unquote pejoratively warehouse spectrum is not good, because we're seeing that there are carriers that can put it to use immediately, benefiting in our case Americans. So we need to keep making sure carriers are actually putting their spectrum to use that they have. I also think as we've seen the significant engineering work that's gone on the last 4 to 5 weeks to make this work, I think it should give all of us that are regulators, an even greater sense of regulatory humility. We've dedicated our lives to this as a service, and so we believe very much in what we do in our jobs. But we also have to understand some of the limits on our expertise, and there's no number of bureaucrats that could have reoriented and re-engineered these networks the way that the actual engineers did to make sure this stays up and running. So I think we should, step back from a micromanaging perspective and see that there are incentives for carriers to adjust and optimize their networks, and that's a really good thing.
Okay. Thank you, Brendan. Just before I forget, for all the participants, I would like to also invite you to respond to the polls that you probably see on the right-hand side of your screen. I know there's a number of questions that have been asked, and we'd like to provide the answers shortly. So you have a few minutes to answer the questions that have been asked. So that's one little ad just before we move on to the next question. So, some of the other measures that have been taken during this COVID, consumer-driven, like move to unlimited plans, and do the members of the panel believe these will stay with us? Is that like a kickstart for 5G? Could it be a kickstart to move to 5G and everything becoming all online, or a large portion much faster than expected? Can I get someone to comment on that? Raise your hand. Yes, Jeremy.
Okay, I'll have a go at it. First of all, I would echo what Brendan said about the expertise of the telecoms operators. And I think it's not just their engineers. In answer to your question, I think the experience we've had here is they haven't needed to be kicked by regulators to do good things for their customers. Everybody has realized in this kind of emergency, it's the right thing to do is to make these kind of packages available. I think you'll find across Europe, unlimited packages are not that unusual anyway. I suspect that once customers find that they like them, they'll keep on them. Some of the issues we've had here about removing of fair usage policies from unlimited plans is something that was a bit of a bone of contention even before the crisis. We couldn't, I think a fair number of us didn't really think it was right to be advertising unlimited if it wasn't really unlimited, or if the fair use policy was used as a matter of course rather than as when it was genuinely needed in order to protect networks from instability. So I think many of these things may stay. I think clearly the generosity that's being shown to users who are in financial difficulties is something which is very specific to the current situation. Of course, I think we all as regulators, we appreciate that operators need to have revenue. We can't expect them, even in a crisis like this, to be providing services free of charge. So whilst I think it is important that people who are going through temporary difficulties are treated generously, then for the longer term, the question of how do we make sure that the more disadvantaged people in society are able to be connected is more of a policy issue than something we should just ask operators to do on their own bat.
Thank you, Jeremy. Does anyone want to comment on the fact that some of the measures we're seeing right now, like lowered prices or subsidies to access broadband, do we think that will continue? Will there be a greater push to reduce the digital divide, inequalities, both in countries where it's in rural areas, as well as in other countries where, for example, satellite, there's very little terrestrial network deployment. So can anybody, RT, do you want to comment on that, please?
Sure. I think there has to be. I think that really is one of the things that has come out of this crisis. There's those people, even in developed countries, who don't have broadband are really suffering at this time. So, I mean, on the connectivity for all side, I think, there is no SDG on bringing connectivity for all. It's seen as an enabler for other SDGs, and I think it needs to be an objective in itself. And I think that goes across the board for Africa, Asia, wherever, rural areas, emerging economies, and so on. And there we need to work on regulatory issues, which are very important, and prevent the entry of certain technologies, but also collaboration, because it's not just about satellite technology. Ultimately, it's about getting people onto their devices and making sure that works, whether it's satellite backhauling a Wi-Fi hotspot, backhauling a mobile base station, or even just providing direct connectivity into the home. At the same time, I think it's, when we talk about connectivity for all, a lot of that is also to do with resiliency. So the ITU has just issued about a month ago its National Emergency Telecom Plan guidelines, and I think one of the things that we should consider is that even though this is a pandemic, it's something unusual, it's something we haven't seen before, it's still a crisis like any other emergency. And connectivity is even more important now that it feels that way compared with a natural disaster or so on. And so some of the guidelines of the National Emergency Telecoms Plans really should be that countries should ensure a critical amount of equipment and training, which is there, that they can use, that they have, that doesn't need to be flown in because maybe there's a lockdown and you can't fly in equipment, or that kind of thing, which is available for emergencies. It could be satellite phones in a drawer. It could be a couple of VSAT dishes lying there, but make sure you have it. Make sure you do simulations through the year, that people know how to use it. Make sure, like in the UK a few years ago, the Department of Health said that all ambulances, all command vehicles had to have satellite built into them going forward. And they did that as part of their resiliency because they saw year on year floods were coming, other disasters were happening, and now this has happened.
Thank you, Artie. I was wondering if we could get some comments from Facebook on this. I noticed, Johan, in your presentation, you talked about deploying broadband in areas in Peru. So do you see that as part of your mission to ensure that access is everywhere around the globe now, or is that part of Facebook's mission?
Thank you. It's definitely part of Facebook's mission, as I said in my introduction. And typically we work together with partners in areas on a variety of technologies. I think that COVID might trigger some of the debates, the regulatory debates globally, by having even more focus on connectivity, in addition to what Artie was just saying. So I think of course, COVID gives us a lot of challenges, but I think one of the positives is that we see how much good we can get out of good connectivity, and that the digital divide needs to be resolved. So we are saying this for many years already. I think that what we also see is that we have very good relationships over the last couple of weeks between telcos, tech industry, regulators, governments. And I think there's so much possible if we work together explaining what our goals are. And I think the connectivity goal is something we all have in common. It's not about lack of competition. It's not about something which is potentially harming things. I think it's all about something we care about. And I think we can see a lot of more activity in those areas. And I think the 6 gigahertz example, like we have seen in the US, and I'm sure that Brandon wants to speak about this maybe a little bit more, is a very bold move. But also what we have seen in Peru is also a government and a regulator who dares to step in with something new, something creative. And I think those kind of things we will see more.
Thank you very much, Johan. I just want to, before we move on, I think Brendan wanted to add, but maybe before you do, I'll provide the results of the first poll. Apparently, we're about 300 on this conference. We have 150 persons that responded to the first poll, and the question was, how successful would you say has been the response by policymakers and industry? So we seem to be in a self-congratulatory mode. And since 13% said very successful, 67% quite successful, and about 20% says not very or very unsuccessful. So I thought I'd share that with you. And Brendan, please go ahead. And maybe after that, Ulf, I think, also indicated he wanted to discuss this. So Brendan, please go ahead.
Thanks. I think this pandemic has put telecom policy in the crucible. And what I mean by that is it has identified and boiled away so many debates we have in telecom that are largely irrelevant to what really matters. I think this pandemic has brought home to us what regulators around the world, operators themselves should all be focused on, which is how do we close and bridge the digital divide? That's what really matters right now. You can take debates like net neutrality. In my view, that was a debate that, people had the luxury to engage in during normal times. But here in the US, it shows that it was a distraction. We lost years of time in the US between 2014 and 2016, putting so much effort into this policy debate around net neutrality. Yet when we reversed that decision in 2016, here's what we saw. Internet speeds are up about 70% since that decision. More miles of high-speed fiber were built out in the US than ever before. Competition for broadband dollars has increased. So I think what this pandemic shows is we have to focus on results. And for the US, I would hope that means let's put in the rearview mirror once and for all this debate about net neutrality that has really nothing to do with closing the digital divide. And let's focus all our efforts on that. And it's not just an access issue, of course, it's an affordability issue as well. So for instance, we're working now with the Department of Education here in the US on a $16 billion funding regime that they were allocated to make sure that school kids can stay online. So I think we absolutely have to stay focused on the priority, bridging the digital divide, making sure this is affordable with our policies, and not on so many other policy debates that are just distractions. And on 6 gigahertz, I'll pick up on there as well. This is so important. I mean, when you think about the pain points in people's daily lives, this is what 6 gigahertz is going to address. The way I describe it is, Facebook is doing some really amazing work around virtual reality, augmented reality. Right now, imagine, I have 3 kids that are home, trying to educate them from home. Imagine having, high-end VR goggles where they could actually feel like they're back in their classroom, or travel to the Middle Ages when they're learning about that. Could be completely transformative. We need spectrum like 6 gigahertz to make that happen. Or think about going to the grocery store. Right now in the US, we have lines around the corner, people staying 6 feet from each other to go grocery shopping. Imagine putting on a VR headset, being transported not to some abstract grocery store, but to your actual grocery store where you know the aisles and what's there, walking down them, picking up a fruit and with haptics, being able to sense whether you want it, tossing it in your virtual basket and having it delivered. These are things that we can get to in the near future, but we need more spectrum to power those applications. That's why opening up 1,200 megahertz of spectrum in 6 is going to be so important.
So you can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So very briefly on the digital divide, I think as I heard from Brendan and others here, of course, this crisis shows the extreme importance of good connectivity, and this shows that what we're talking about is something that is really critical infrastructure, not only in a crisis, but going beyond the crisis, and hopefully sooner rather than later, when we're out on the crisis, we have to sort of rebuild our economies and our societies. Good connectivity will be absolutely critical, not only in emerging markets, but there, of course, I think that in this crisis, we see that this leads to lack of information and lack of ability to do mobile payments, for example, which has a huge potential in Africa. We're doing that in some markets, but not enough. And I agree here that it is not so much a technology issue, it's about the regulatory and also creating good investment conditions for the operators to build out. But then if you talk about more advanced markets, I think that we certainly need more spectrum and not only unlicensed. I think that we need now also not to postpone 5G auctions, etc. Because what we see now, and referencing to China is already at 50 million mobile subscribers on 5G and investing heavily in that market. And North America and Europe and other markets, we cannot afford to be left behind here. So, but then we need to secure low-band spectrum, mid-band, and that's a challenge, as Commissioner Carr knows, in the US. And of course, we would have liked to see a more focus on mid-band in the US and high-band. 100 megahertz continuous spectrum in mid-band and 1 gigahertz continuous spectrum in high bands. That will be absolutely crucial. So don't let's sort of forget about the license spectrum issue when we move ahead. That will be absolutely important for emerging markets, but also for the most advanced markets that are now investing heavily in 5G.
Thank you very much. Just before we move on to the next panelist, I think RT, you raised your hand. I wanted to share with all of you the results of the second poll, which is, do you think that we will exit this crisis with changed expectations, targets, and goals for tackling the digital divide, a subject we've just been discussing at length? And 84% overwhelmingly, yes, increased urgency versus 16% unchanged. So there's some skepticism out there, but I think there's a lot of optimism. So we just have 5 minutes left in the panel discussion. So RT, would you like to chime in? You raised your hand, so.
Yeah, sure. I think just 2 points on this digital divide issue. The first one is, I agree spectrum is important, and I think it's really important that we get the message out there to all regulators that where you have harmonized, identified spectrum, make sure you license it as fast as you can. But the other thing is, the reason we have a digital divide in so much of the world is not spectrum. It's the cost. It's the cost of rolling out terrestrial infrastructure as a standalone. We have to we have to make room for and foster collaboration across sectors to ensure that we can really roll out hybrid solutions as fast as possible.
Thank you. And I think, maybe Jeremy, you can make the last comment before I make the closing comments. We just have a few minutes left.
That's a fantastic privilege. I was going to say, I'm really happy with the result of the second poll and the great consensus around this panel, as Brendan said, that what really matters is closing the digital divide. I would take a slightly different lesson from the experience, which is also that a lot of the other regulatory issues that have got us excited over the years, like net neutrality or access regulation, have turned out to be rather less significant than people might have thought as a driver or as an effector on investment. So we've seen, despite very different regulatory approaches in the US and in Europe, actually networks have stood up just as well in both places to the stresses of the pandemic. I would say that in Europe over the last few years, we spent an awful lot of time debating the European Electronic Communications Code, an awful lot of discussion about what was very high capacity networks, what they call there, which is, I think, fiber or things of fiber-like speeds. But actually, in that code, there's also an article about adequate broadband for all and universal service. My expectation is that article will get a lot more attention now moving forward. I think Artie talked about the cost of deploying networks. Of course, there are questions about technology, different technologies that can be used in these rural areas. There's also the question of state subsidies. Just from the Irish experience, just before Christmas, the government signed a contract which will result in very high-speed broadband for every premises in Ireland, in rural Ireland. That was a hugely controversial political move to make. I suspect that now the idea of continuing that is much less controversial. The business case and the societal benefit from universal broadband has been proven beyond reasonable doubt.
All right. Thank you very much. I think we have just 1 minute left. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think if I try to make some conclusions, yes, the digital divide, the race is on. That has to be closed. I think it's important in the US. We see the activities of the FCC. You have the 3.5 gigahertz auctions coming. You have also, I know, the reverse subsidy auctions planned for this year. Not much delays in auction. I hope it stays like that. I agree with the comments made. I don't think 5G auctions should be delayed. I think 5G will be needed even more than ever starting next year. So we concur with regulators. Please keep going ahead and take the whip out if need be sometimes. I know some carriers might be asking for delays or things like that, but everybody's a little bit under stress. I think if companies like Facebook, you have certainly a lot of challenges out there. We didn't talk too much about we talked about what you're doing in terms of misinformation, the 5G and the COVID virus. Hopefully these things can be put to bed, although we know they might stay for a while. I know there were some questions on the impact on that unfortunately we didn't get to on the investment and spectrum cost, but maybe we can leave that for the next portion of this conference, which is the Have Your Say. So maybe we can discuss that. What are the expected implications, maybe, or what do we expect in terms of the spectrum costs, over the next year or 12 to 18 months? Is this going to have any impact? Will governments be looking to get more money from spectrum because they have so many higher expenses and differences in investment between US and North America, the US and Europe? So those were some of the questions we didn't get to, but we have now will be the time as we move to the next section of our webinar. So I guess that's where we are. Can we move on to the next portion?
We can indeed, and I think I'd like to say a huge thank you to Joanne and to all of our panelists for that discussion. So thank you very much to all of you. It was a really interesting panel. I'm sure everyone will agree, and it's great to hear about all the innovative measures that are being taken all over the world by both policymakers and industry to keep communities connected and also to kind of help during the pandemic and the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. So all of you, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and your comments, and that was a really interesting session. So next up, as Joanne has mentioned, we have a session which we're calling Have Your Say, and it's your turn to get involved. So I know that there were quite a few comments that unfortunately, due to lack of time, that were made that we weren't able to get to as part of that panel there, but it's now your opportunity, or a second opportunity, I should say, for you all to make your point. So in a second, I'm going to invite you all to head over to the Have Your Say meeting room, which is situated in the sessions area. So you need to click on the sessions button on the left-hand side of your menu. And we then have 30 minutes of discussion where we want to hear directly from all of you out there, all of you in the audience. So when we get into the room, you're all going to have the opportunity to request to take the floor. So you can click Request Participate, which will enable you to bring your audio and video feed live. And we have Joanne is going to be there, and we're also going to have Amit Nagpal is going to be joining us to dissect some of the discussions that will take place in the panel just now, and also then to invite, as I say, you all to come up on stage to give your thoughts, and of course, if you prefer, to listen to the broader views that the other members of the audience may have. So if I could invite you all to head over to the Have Your Say room. As I said, it's in the Sessions tab on the left-hand menu. And I hope that some of our speakers will also be joining us, and again, to continue to take part in the discussions there. And I'll see you over there in a few seconds. And once again, before we go, I'd just like to say a very big thank you again to all of our speakers from this session, from the earlier session as well. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you hopefully in the Sessions tab, the Have Your Say room, in just a couple of seconds. So see you in a second. Thank